certain foods are going to drive up inflammation in certain people. There is a level of what is called bioindividuality. A lot of different things come into play. What your microbiome looks like, what your history looks like, what your level of reactive oxygen species look like, all kinds of different things. So before I really dive into what I would consider the most inflammatory foods, just understand that there are certain foods that might affect you that don't affect me. And you can generally tell if you feel inflamed, okay? You start retaining water, you start feeling lethargic, maybe your joints hurt. Okay? The inflammatory response is normal and welcome within our bodies, okay? We want it. Okay? If we were to bump our knee or if we were to get a sinus infection, we would get that swelling, right? We get that increase in blood flow, that increase in fluid that is bringing along with it the ability to fight whatever issue is going on. So we don't want to hate on inflammation, but when we have it happening in a way that it shouldn't be, that's when we run into issues. And too much over the long haul, too much over even a short period of time can affect our DNA, it can damage cells, it can even kill cells. So let's break down foods that are, I don't know, have a lot of evidence that they do drive up inflammation so we can modulate them. And I'm not recommending that you become orthorexic and become obsessed with this, but just pay attention because you might start noticing it. So let's dive in. The first one is kind of an obvious one, sugar and refined carbohydrates. Now, some people will say, no, it's not a big deal. As long as you're, consuming X amount of calories, you're going to be fine. There's still a lot of research that demonstrates that heavily refined sugars and starches trigger some potential issues here. There was a study that was published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It took a look at 47 type 2 diabetics. This was really interesting because it was a 6-month study. And with this 6-month study, they had them consume either 1 liter of soda per day that had sugar in it, obviously, 1 liter of milk per day, 1 liter of diet soda, or 1 liter of water. Okay. Well, what they wanted to look at is, well, what is driving up potential inflammation? What are we seeing here? Well, it turns out that the soft drink group, the group that was consuming the sugary soda, had an increase in uric acid by about 15%. Now, uric acid is sort of a precursor to other inflammatory responses within the body. What was fascinating about this is that this only happened in the sugar soda group. It didn't even happen in the diet soda group. So I know that some people, like to really kind of weigh out regular soda versus diet soda. Although I'm not a fan of diet soda overall, I do think that sugary sodas end up having a more negative effect. But this is just to showcase how sugar has an effect on inflammation, because uric acid, especially in women, we've seen it is a precursor to, of course, inflammation. Now, there was also a study that was published in the journal Food and Function that was pretty interesting, because this looked at a little more nuancy with glucose and fructose. So in this case, it was a mice study, but they divided the mice into 3 different groups. A group that consumed high glucose, a group that consumed high fructose, and a group that consumed a control, okay? In this case, they found the fructose group and the sucrose group, which is basically a combination of glucose and fructose, drove up what's called hyperinsulinemia, so higher levels of insulin, but they also had an increase in what are called adipokines. So these are inflammatory cytokines that are released typically by fat cells. Okay, so we saw an increase there. There's also an increase in fatty deposits in the liver. Okay, so we know that glucose and fructose consumption in high amounts can potentially drive this. However, it was noticed that fructose triggered it ever so slightly more, not significantly more, but more than regular glucose, probably because we're not designed to consume copious amounts of fructose at one time, whereas we are a little bit more designed to consume glucose, right? Because we can just deal with it better. We weren't designed to be eating 500 grams of fructose from fruit because fiber would slow it down. All these things naturally would slow it down. But there was also an increase in what is called necroinflammation, which indicates that you're going from a fatty liver to a little bit more of a steatohepatitis, which is a more permanent kind of liver issue that can come as a result of that. So the bottom line with that is, yes, just limit the sugar. It isn't something you should be having copious amounts of. Also put a link down below for my favorite probiotic, which people always ask me what it is. It's seed. It's the only probiotic that I'd recommend. And the reason I mentioned even relevant to this video is our gut health actually plays a huge role in insulin resistance. And a lot of us forget that, ranging from the inflammatory response of lipopolysaccharides, but also just the fact that when you have a diverse microbiome, you end up with more of these short-chain fatty acids that can support glucose metabolism at a cellular level. So yes, the gut health matters. I put a link down below for 25% off Seed's Daily Symbiotic. Big fan of them. Appreciate their support of this channel for so many years. Also something that I take daily. So the link is down below in the top line of the description. The next one is going to be trans fats. Now, if you don't know what a trans fat is a regular fat that was maybe not saturated, where they artificially add a hydrogen molecule to it to make it saturated. They add hydrogen to it to make it an artificially man-made saturated fat. obviously not good from the get-go. When it comes to inflammation, pretty clear. There was a study that was published in the journal Nutrition that took a look at 730 women, and it took a look at their diets, and it kind of organized who ate the most trans fats. Well, they found that there was a very linear response, with the women that ate the highest amount of trans fats having significantly higher levels of C-reactive protein. In this case, their C-reactive protein was 73% higher than those that had low levels of trans fats in their diet. And when it came down to what's called their interleukin-6 levels, which is another inflammatory signal, inflammatory cytokine, we were talking about 17% higher with that group. So we're looking big difference here. High amounts of trans fats in this observational data, high amounts of inflammation. Now, both C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 are pretty powerful predictors of cardiovascular disease. Okay, there's a lot of ways that they wrap around affect that. So they're huge risk factors. So definitely things we need to be paying attention to. Now, what we've noticed is that C-reactive protein can influence what is called atherogenesis, which is literally the formation of plaque. Okay, and then tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6, which were both driven up, are indicators of cardiovascular disease and also coronary heart disease. So bottom line is trans fats are not good. Okay, there's also association with trans fats and visceral adipose tissue. Once we have more visceral adipose tissue, that's the fat that's underneath our belly, right? That's kind of like the pot belly-ish stuff. That itself leaks inflammatory cytokines. So once we have that in our system, then we are consistently leaking more inflammatory cytokines because we have that visceral adipose tissue. Something you'll be paying very close attention to. So with snacks, with beverages, with treats, things like that, no hydrogenated oils, nothing like that, and try to limit the sugar. Go for things like maybe erythritol, maybe stevia, maybe monk fruit, so you can lessen that impact. The next one is alcohol. Now, this is a two-pronged approach because alcohol affects inflammation via two different pathways. So this first study was published in the journal Alcohol. Took a look at 840 women and 490 men. Now, with this, it was more observational, but they found that alcohol intake was linearly associated with uric acid levels being higher in women, and then in men, alcohol intake was linearly associated with C-reactive protein levels being higher. So that's kind of interesting, showing that alcohol is possibly affecting men and women differently, but with men, it's directly influencing C-reactive protein, and with women, it's influencing uric acid, which influences C-reactive protein and ultimately interleukin-6. So it's not to say one is worse than the other, but it's influencing in slightly different ways. The other way that we are seeing that alcohol is possibly influencing inflammation is through what is called a leaky gut. Now, I'm careful to even talk about a leaky gut because it's such an over-marketed, overhyped term, but it's a very real thing because alcohol, as we know, is literally a poison, okay? It's very, very difficult to break down. Our liver tries to deal with it, but when we're digesting it or it's going through the GI tract, it can break down and damage the cells within our intestinal tract, okay? These are called endothelial cells or epithelial cells, excuse me. So what can happen is when we're breaking down alcohol in the gastrointestinal tract, it can damage the cells within our gut. Okay, within our gut lining. Now, these cells do a really good job of keeping tight junctions within our gut so that things don't get into the bloodstream that shouldn't get into the bloodstream. Now, in the case of what are called lipopolysaccharides, LPS or lipopolysaccharides, these are they're not pathogenic bacteria, but they're bacteria that are really within our gut, in our hermetically sealed gut for specific purposes. What happens is if we have damage to the gut lining of the cells that line our gut, these lipopolysaccharides can leak into the bloodstream. And when they leak into the bloodstream, that triggers an inflammatory cascade to battle those lipopolysaccharides. That is inflammation at its very core. We're dealing with a foreign particle that's not supposed to be in the bloodstream. It's supposed to remain in our nicely sealed GI tract. So when we damage the gut with too much alcohol, we run into that issue. So we have a twofold effect when it comes down to inflammation. The next one is a very interesting one. And I say this because before we thought that red meat was the issue. Now we're starting to see it's more about the processing of the meat that's the issue versus the kind of meat per se. So this study was published in the journal Circulation, and it was taking a look at just that, red versus processed meat. And it was just trying to set this out and see what is going on here. So it took a look at over 1 million people with 20 different studies. And they found that red meat was not really the driver of cardiovascular disease and was not a driver of type 2 diabetes. But what seemed to be was the processed meat itself. There is a lot of potential mechanistic stuff going on there. One of the theories is that the processed meat, on one side, it could be correlational. People that consume processed meat, maybe they're consuming more refined starches along with it. Just the kind of people that might be consuming lots of processed meat are consuming that with processed refined carbs. That's one theory, of course. But when they looked at all the data, they found that people that consume processed meat did have a 42% higher risk of cardiovascular disease and a 19% increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So there's something going on there. So they chalked it up more than likely to what are called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. Now, what these are is when reduced sugars from foods that we consume that are processed, the reduction of those sugars, they interact with proteins that are in our body, okay? And they become what is called glycosylated. Now, that's like caramelizing an onion. So if you were to cook an onion and caramelize it, you would get these sugars that form. So that's sort of like the glycosylated proteins. What happens is they can actually hang out in our arteries. They can end up influencing trapping of plaque. So they'll trap these plasma proteins that affect how flexible our arteries and our veins and our vessels are. And they can also reduce the levels of nitric oxide synthase. Okay, when you reduce that nitric oxide, you have less flexibility to the vessel wall, meaning the vessel becomes more rigid. So this could be one of the reasons that we see advanced glycation end products being correlated with cardiovascular disease, and obviously the inflammation that comes along with that. So definitely something we'll be paying attention to. So whenever you can go fresh, much better. I would much rather say go for a fresh, unadulterated, leaner filet than going for, say, well, bologna. Now, the next one couples up with soda again. It's our friend sodium benzoate. Okay, sodium benzoate is a preservative, and it's in a lot of different beverages. Okay, so be careful with it, because it's one of those things that in high amounts, maybe not in modest amounts, but high amounts, is seeming to drive some issues, at least in the rodent model studies. Now, with soda, I say it's a double whammy because we already have the sugar issue. Okay, the sugar issue we talked about, and now we're adding in this sodium benzoate issue. And sodium benzoate is definitely artificial. What it is benzoic acid along with sodium hydroxide. So they combine these together as a preservative. Well, interesting data. There's a study that was published in the journal Drug and Chemical Toxicology. Now, this was done in rats, but they took a look at specific dosages. In this case, 70 milligrams, 200 milligrams, 400 milligrams, and 700 milligrams per kilogram of body weight in mice. They found that the 200, the 400, and the 700 milligram per kilogram amounts did influence an increase in inflammation, although the 70 milligram per kilogram dosage did not, which indicates that we do need higher amounts, but since it was dose dependent, it was able to be speculated that, yeah, it probably is this sodium benzoate that's driving up this inflammatory response in these mice. They saw an increase in all the things we don't want to increase: tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 6, and interleukin 1 beta, which is like a precursor to more inflammation. Now, additionally, there was another study published in the journal Neuroscience that took a look at mice once again. In this particular case, they had 200 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of sodium benzoate, and they found that they had difficulty completing a maze. Okay, so they had a decrease in the rotarod function and probably an increase in anxiety that made them really not be able to handle the maze very well. Again, it's speculation. We don't know the causation or the mechanistic action here, but some researchers speculate that it could have to do with inflammation within the brain. So I'm not saying that sodium benzoate is like the worst thing in the world, but there's some evidence that's coming out, at least in rodent models, that it's a little bit sketchy. And when you combine it with the known effects of sugar being highly inflammatory, maybe that's something you should avoid in terms of the sugary soft drinks, okay? So just to recap, sugar and refined starches, trans fats like hydrogenated oils that are going to be in like low quality peanut butter and vegetable shortening and margarine and things like that. Limit the alcohol consumption to a couple days per week if you can. Okay, then processed meat. The red meat's not the issue, it's the processed meat. Then we have the sodium benzoate. As always, keep it locked here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.